So today I want to show you a new feature in Cloud 66 Skycap called Skycap Formations. Formations are a way to generate, build, and maintain Kubernetes configuration files from your application onto any Kubernetes cluster. Nowadays, you can go to Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, or Amazon, and with a few clicks, you get a Kubernetes cluster. But then you also need to go and craft Kubernetes configuration files that represent your application, the components that you need in your app, and then apply them to your cluster. And sometimes those tasks might become challenging. Formations are a way to make that much simpler, secure, and easy. Let me go ahead and show you how. Here I have a simple Skycap application which I've built. It's a single service application that's built from the source code. It's written in Go, but that doesn't really matter in this case. If you want to see how to put this together, it's about 3 clicks, and there's a link that we put on the video to show you how to put this together. It's very simple to get to this stage. Now here I'm going to go and set up deployment, and instead of using Maestro, which will create the cluster for me and deploy the application, here I want to use Formations to deploy this app to my Minikube locally and then later on to GKE. So let me click on Deploy with Formations. Okay, so now formations are enabled on my Skycap application. And I'm going to create a new formation. I'll call it my sample. And the base template I'm going to use is the one that I have called sample. And what is a base template? So usually when you deploy an application to Kubernetes, you have a set of configuration files. Some of them are you just run once, for example, like setting up your namespace, and some of them you run every time you do a deployment, like the ones that have the deployments or services of Kubernetes or pod configuration setups in those configuration files. And a base template is a collection of all those that I want to put together myself. If you want to see an example of that, for example, here, this is my sample base template that I've chosen there. It's actually publicly available. You can see it on Cloud 66/stencils. And here, I have an example setup YAML, which sets up a namespace for me, and my Docker registry secrets are available here. Now, I also have one for deployment, for services, and I have one for Redis. This means that I can put these together for my team so they can use it. They don't need to repeat something over and over again, but it also would mean that I can only lock down the team to use these ones because these are the approved configuration settings that I have. With that, I'm just going to create a formation and go in. So my base template has categorized the templates that I have, which we call stencils, in 3 categories. This is arbitrary grouping, and it's just there to help us find where each one of those templates can be. On the config, I can use setup. And here, as you can see, it's the same template we saw on GitHub that's now available to me. Here, it's an editor. I can edit it if I want to, but I'm not going to touch anything. I think the default is good enough, and we get back to what these placeholders are. Now, this entire file system and the templates and the formations are all backed by a Git repository. You can use your own Git client and your own text editor to edit them. You don't need to use the web-based text editor, but in the interest of just simplicity, I'm just going to use the web editor we have. So I'm going to save my setup. Right. Now, my application also uses Redis. And as you remember, we had a Redis setup there as well, which I put in here. And this is just the basic Redis deployment on Kubernetes. It's not high availability and it's not backed up, so don't use that in production. But it's just an example that I have. And it's very simple. It has a deployment and a service, as you would expect. I'm going to add that to my formation as well. Now, we had only one service, so let me just create a deployment for that service, which is a Kubernetes deployment. This is how I put my stencil together. Here I have a name for it. This $ curly bracket service will be replaced with the service name. And as I have only one service, I can see what service I'm going to choose this for. I don't need to change anything here apart from the port. My application is served on port 80. And the executable is app pilot. I need to give it the address for the Redis instance. If I'm not mistaken, that's the port for Redis, and that's it. I'm going to add this to my formation too. Okay, now the last thing I need is a service. It's a Kubernetes service again. It's available in my templates. And here it is. Again, this is a starting point for the template. I got it from my repository, but I can also go and edit it if I want to. In this case, all I'm going to do is I'm going to just change the port. I'm going to deploy this one on Minikube. So I'm going to use a port above 80, so I don't need sudo permissions to run on my laptop. And commit that. Okay, I think now I have everything I need to deploy my app to my Kubernetes cluster. Now I'm going to open up another tab, and in there we can see the build and deployments of my stack. What I can do now is I can take a snapshot of my app. What is a snapshot? So snapshot is when we pull in all the code from all different source code repositories that are attached to each service, we build them on build grid, and then we create the Docker image based on that, we push it to a private Docker repository that's available to you. And if you're using pre-built images, let's say you have a CI/CD pipeline that generates the images for you as part of your test, we can just pull it down and then retag it if you want, push it into another repository or keep it in the same repository. The act of taking a snapshot is taking a snapshot of your code, your configuration, and your Kubernetes configurations at the same time. So you essentially create a infrastructure time machine that you can go back and forth and deploy old code to new infrastructure or new code to old infrastructure to assess for debugging, for performance assessments, or other purposes. So what's happening now is that my source code is being pulled in to build grid. It's being built, as you can see. This is being built. It's using Habitus as well, which is a Docker workflow project where it dovetails multiple builds into one. But now that it's built, here I can go to build and deployment. And I can see that this build was successful and I have my formation here. So when I click on that, I can see if I want to use my latest Kubernetes configuration files in there, which is the case in this case. And here I am. So now I have all my configuration files, this time filled out with the values. So all the images are now automatically annotated, so I can trace them back. And it's not just the images, it's actually every component like namespace and secrets. You can see my Redis is there. My deployment is here. And the name of the service, for example, was replaced. And the service is also there. Okay, so now let's go ahead and deploy this to my Minikube. Okay, so now I have my Minikube running. There's no namespace here. All I need to do is to click on this link, which will use Cloud66 toolbelt, a command line tool that we have, which in turn uses our API. I'm just going to paste it here. The only thing I need to change in this case is I need to just make sure that I'm using the right account, because this is my demo account. So I just use toolbelt multi-account feature. And if I just run this, I see that my formation rendered stencils or fully populated configuration files for Kubernetes are now generated. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to pipe this into my kube control. And I should now have the namespace. Here it is, generated. should have the pods running. I should also have my service running, both Redis and this one. And just to see if it works, I'm just going to use Minikube to open up a web browser to see what my service is up to. And here it is. Okay, so what did we do now? We just created a formation, which is a deployment destination. We used some templates that we had, but we can also use a blank template here and just write our configuration file from scratch if we want to. And then we commit that into a Git repository, which doesn't have to be our code repository, so that we can have multiple code repositories, one for code, one for configuration. We used stencils and snapshots to render them into usable configuration files for my Kubernetes. And we just applied it with a single command, piped it into my Kubernetes configuration file, my kube control, so they hit the cluster. It means that I don't need to share my Kubernetes secrets or access credentials with Cloud 66. And also I can pull the configuration files down and do any search and replace that I want to do if I want to replace the secrets, for example, in those with any tools there on my client or on a build server as well. Now, this was a very short and quick demonstration of what we can do with formations, but there's a lot more informations than to formations that you saw now. For example, you can restrict access to a single stencil based on user, based on the actions they can do. One of the good things that you can do here is you can restrict access, for example, to a team so they can view and edit but not render this. This would allow me to get my developers, ask my developers, for example, to construct the configuration files that they need, but they will not see the fully rendered version of that, because that might contain some secrets that we will render into the placeholders at the point of the render, when the render happens. And that is a very powerful thing to protect your infrastructure from getting bad configuration committed to it. There's also a lot more about configuration files and stencils and what they do and how they operate that you can read on our help site. So if I go to help.cloud66.com on the Skycap site, quick starts, you can see a lot about how formations can be used, but also you can see the formation placeholders that you can use here, and all different variations of that, including automatic injection of your registry or Docker repository credentials into your configuration files, environment variables, using inlines, for example, to inject one configuration file into another one for reusability, bulk import of environment variables, and so on. You can also do things like requiring a change in your configuration, so it will not render until some specific value like the port number or the command is entered. And there's a lot more that you can use here. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you check out Skycap Formations and let us know what you think. Thank you.